What would you do if in the year 2025, someone accused you of kidnapping your own daughter, just because of the color of your skin? Some people still believe racism is exaggerated, that everything is just whining, that all it takes to be respected is to be right. But what happens when you do everything right, and they still treat you like a criminal, when the problem isn't what you've done, but what they see in you? She was holding her daughter, all the documents in hand, ready to board. But all it took was a sideways glance, one wrong assumption, and within minutes, she was sitting in an inspection room, accused of kidnapping her own daughter. But what no one in that room knew was that this woman, black, calm, holding a baby, was not just anyone. She knew the system. She wrote the laws, and what happened next became a national lesson. The morning began like any other, at Atlanta International Airport. That fast-paced flow of families, executives, backpackers, and announcements blending into the sound of suitcase wheels and voices in different languages. Among the crowd, a black woman, dressed in quiet elegance, held her sleeping baby in her arms. She walked in silence, her eyes alert. A folded birth certificate in her purse, the boarding pass between her fingers. She walked with the steady steps of someone who knows exactly where she's going, but in her heart carried the weight of someone who learned very early that dignity for people like her always comes with a test. In the boarding line, while adjusting her daughter's blanket and trying to keep her gaze calm, an airline employee frowned. It only took a second, a slanted glance, an offbeat question. "Is this baby yours?" The question came with a sweet tone, but was loaded with judgment. The words slipped out behind a professional smile, while her eyes were already searching for a supervisor. The mother answered with a serene yes, but something in the air had shifted. One of those moments when silence begins to scream louder than the conversations around you. Minutes later, 2 security agents approached. Forced cordiality, repeated questions, that fake sense of just a protocol. The woman, who just wanted to board a flight to New York with her daughter, was now surrounded, as if she were a threat. People began to notice. Some watched with curiosity, others with discomfort, and most with that familiar look, the kind that creates a whole story in their heads. A story where she was the guilty one. All of that, without even knowing her name. She took a deep breath. The baby woke up with the movement, moving her little arms, instinctively seeking the warmth of her mother. And there she was, trying to stay calm, trying to protect her daughter not just from the airport terminal's air conditioning, but from something far more cruel. That moment wasn't about aborting. It was about identity, about how many times a black woman has to prove she is enough, that she is capable, that she is worthy, that she is a mother. And while the words kidnapping and security check were whispered around as if they were normal, she squinted her eyes. She knew what was coming wouldn't be easy, but she also knew she was not just anyone. Her name was Maya Peterson. At 38 years old, she held more titles than could fit on a business card. But she learned early on that, for many people, what mattered wasn't her accomplishments, but the color of her skin. She was a federal judge in the state of Georgia, a specialist in civil law and child protection, known for her firmness in the courtroom and her humanity in her verdicts. Maya was also a single mother, and considered that, among all her roles, the most sacred one. That trip to New York was both professional and personal. She was going to speak on a national panel about racial equality, and taking her daughter with her was a matter of principle. The baby in her arms was named Ava, and even though people had often said, "They don't look like mother and daughter," Maya always answered with pride and a quiet smile. Because for her, Motherhood was never about color. It was about presence, protection, and strength, and in that, no one could question her. That day, she wore a neutral and elegant outfit, her hair pulled into a neat, natural bun. Simple earrings, there was nothing in her appearance that didn't shout, prepared, composed, confident, but there was also nothing in her appearance that could protect her from the distorted lens of prejudice, because, in the United States, even a black woman with a federal badge holding her own daughter could still be seen as a threat. And that said much more about the system than about her. In the airport line, Maya looked around with the trained eyes of someone who had analyzed many expressions. She knew how to read the signs, the tension in the employee's shoulders, the whisper on the radio, the politeness masking discomfort. Still, she kept her tone firm and respectful, because that's how she had won so many battles. With a steady voice, direct eye contact, and an unshakable faith in the truth. She just didn't know that, on this day, her story would be seen by thousands, and that it would all start with one absurd question. It was supposed to be just another boarding. But with Maya, things were rarely just anything. She walked up to gate 23, holding Ava in her arms, documents ready in hand. The attendant looked at her, then looked again, and hesitated. It was the kind of pause that doesn't need sound to say everything. Maya knew that pause well. A second of doubt that carried years of disguised judgment. "Hi, can I see the child's documents?" asked the employee, forcing a smile. Maya handed them over naturally, already expecting the next step. The prolonged stare, the comparison between the birth certificate and the baby's appearance, the veiled discomfort. Then came the question, "Are you the biological mother?" The tone was quiet, but just loud enough for the woman in the next row to raise her eyes and glance at Ava with thinly veiled curiosity. Maya answered with her usual calm, "Yes, I am," and inside, she was already preparing her emotional armor, because she knew. It didn't matter how impressive her resume was, how steady her tone, or how flawless her posture. When her skin color clashed with her daughter's, the doubt always fell on her, never on the others. The attendant was no longer hiding her discomfort. She discreetly called another employee, who arrived with the same overly professional, suspicious look. Maya was no longer just holding Ava in her arms. She was now also carrying the weight of yet another act of discrimination, the kind that doesn't scream but bleeds, the kind that drains your humanity in the name of a supposed protocol. And as always, no one around said a thing. It was the kind of silence that only reinforces the idea that, to many people, a black woman with a light-skinned daughter is a mistake that needs to be corrected. Soon, TSA agents were called. 2 tall, men in uniform arrived with the usual polite demeanor, but with eyes that said everything. One of them took Maya's documents from her hands, without asking permission. The other began asking questions. Dates, names, destinations. Ava squirmed, sensing the tension in her mother's arms. Maya didn't raise her voice. She didn't lose her composure. Because she knew that, for a woman like her, any reaction could be used against her. But inside, something was already boiling. It wasn't rage, it was an old pain, mixed with the strength of a mother who never, Maya, was led to an isolated room near the secondary inspection area. There were no windows, just cold metal chairs, a counter, and cameras overhead. She entered with her daughter still in her arms, her heart beating with controlled firmness. There were no shouts, no pushing. But what hurt was even worse, the feeling of being treated as guilty, in silence, as someone who, once again, had to prove that she belonged where she was. Ava began to cry. Maya rocked her with one hand, while with the other she handed over the documents: birth certificate, passport, ID card, the essentials, only the essentials. She gave the flight number, showed the tickets, kept her gaze steady. She avoided further explanations. That wasn't the place, not in front of eyes that had already decided who she was, to explain the reason for her trip. And that seemed to bother the agents, her silence, her restraint. One of them took notes. The other asked again, "Aren't you going to tell us why you're going to New York?" Maya simply breathed and said, "It's an important trip," and nothing more, because sometimes the silence of a black woman is more powerful than any justification. Meanwhile, outside the room, the whispers grew louder. Passengers whispered among themselves, inventing versions of the story based on what they had seen. A black woman being escorted by security with a baby in her arms. A young airport employee spoke in a low voice. "Looks like she tried to board with a child that isn't hers," and that was enough to plant the seed of judgment. No one wondered how that was affecting the baby. No one thought about what it meant for that woman to hear, once again, that her love needed to be validated by strangers. Inside the room, Maya adjusted her daughter in her arms, pulled the baby's coat up to her chin, and looked at her with tenderness. On the outside, she was composed. But inside, she felt the burn of that humiliation. It wasn't just for her. It was for every black woman who has ever been dehumanized without anyone speaking up. For every mother who has been treated like a nanny. For every child taken from the arms of the one who gave birth to them, because of pure prejudice. And there, sitting in that cold chair, holding her daughter, she made a silent decision. This story would not end like this. While the agents typed slowly on an outdated computer, Maya looked at her own reflection in the glass of the door. She didn't just see herself, she saw everything she carried. In her eyes, there was the firmness of someone who learned early that discrimination doesn't always come in shouts. Sometimes, it comes in forms, in sideways glances, in questions disguised as concern. She knew that because she knew the system from the inside. She was a federal judge, specialized in civil rights. She had ruled on dozens of cases about institutional racism. But, right there, in that moment, she wasn't the authority. She was the suspect, the one being questioned, the black woman who once again had to prove the obvious. She had lived that same play with different costumes her entire life. Maya was born and raised on the south side of Chicago, where opportunities were rare and judgment constant, where cracked sidewalks shared space with dreams squeezed into the pages of school notebooks. She was the daughter of Lucille, a seamstress with calloused hands who made custom dresses in their living room and even exhausted, still embroidered courage into every word she told her daughter. If they give you a closed door, build an entrance with the windows. Maya heard it so many times that one day she believed it. Her father was Harold, a public bus driver who always picked her up after school in his wrinkled uniform, and with a wide smile on his face. They never had much, but they taught her something no one could take away: family pride. They always said, "You don't need to change who you are. You just need to remember every day where you came from." At 12 years old, Maya saw her father being stopped by the police in front of their home, handcuffed for no reason, in front of the neighbors, in front of her wide, frightened eyes. She would never forget the image of Harold saying, "It's okay, baby," with his hands cuffed behind his back. From that day on, she decided she would learn the law, that she would use her voice where her father had to stay silent. In her teenage years, she faced more than school exams. She faced teachers who didn't believe in her potential, guidance counselors who suggested that maybe the college path was too ambitious, stares that said, "You don't belong here." But she stayed. She fought. She studied with dedication. She got into Howard University on a full scholarship, then went on to Yale Law School. Early in her career, she was treated like an intern, even though her badge said prosecutor. She didn't correct them. She just looked, and in that look, there was an entire message, because Maya learned that the real answer comes when you don't lower your head. When you keep going, grow, and become undeniable. But when she took on the position of federal judge, the headline still emphasized, first black woman in the district to hold the position. None of that weakened her. On the contrary, each obstacle became part of her armor. And all of that she carried in that moment, sitting in the cold chair of the inspection room, holding the daughter who had come as a blessing, as continuation, as a mission. The conference in New York, the one she was traveling to, was just another chapter. But symbolically, maybe it was the most important one. There, she would speak about premature judgment, silent discrimination, and the real impact of prejudice on black families, and the fight for equality. She just hadn't expected to live through all of it, in the flesh, just minutes before boarding that plane. Now there, in the inspection room, under cold lights and blank stares. She carried all of it. She wasn't just a mother with documents. She was a woman who knew the bitter taste of humiliation, but also the weight and value of overcoming it. She looked at Ava, who had fallen asleep again, despite the tense atmosphere. That gave Maya an extra dose of courage. And even though the folder containing her speech was in her carry-on, even though her official ID was in her purse, she didn't pull out her badge because her reaction would be different. Not confrontation, but a lesson. She knew that sooner or later they would find out who she was. And when they did, the surprise wouldn't just be theirs, it would belong to the entire country, because she didn't just want to prove a point. She wanted to teach a lesson. And for that, time was on her side. It had been long minutes of waiting. The kind of wait that isn't measured in ticking clocks, but in discomfort. Maya remained seated, her gaze fixed on nothing. Ava was now awake in her lap, sucking her thumb with the serenity only a baby knows. The silence in the room was broken only by the clicking of keys and the hum of the air conditioning, which felt colder than it should have. Until suddenly the door opened firmly and someone different walked into the room. She wore a navy blue suit, a TSA badge, her hair pulled back with military precision. She was a senior supervisor, and the way the others adjusted in their seats made that clear. She asked for the documents again, looked more closely at Maya's passport. For a moment, her eyebrows lifted, slightly. She typed the full name into the internal system. And then she froze. The air felt heavier for a second. The name on the screen wasn't common. It was known. Recognized. A name that echoed in important rooms. Quoted in panel discussions. Featured in news articles. And, recently, on a closed list of potential Supreme Court nominees. Maya Peterson. The woman sitting there in the metal chair, treated like a criminal, wasn't just any citizen. She was a federal judge, one of the most influential working in civil rights in the United States. Decorated, a frequent guest at international conferences, keynote speaker at the New York Congress, the one printed on her boarding pass. The supervisor's silence was broken by a timid question. "Are you Judge Peterson?" Maya simply tilted her head slightly, as someone who confirms without needing to prove anything. What once looked like protocol was now turning into a deeply embarrassing moment. The room where she had been treated with suspicion now felt too small to contain the discomfort. The agents around her, the same ones who had doubted, questioned, suspected, now looked like children caught in the act. Their words disappeared like dust. One stammered. Another looked away, pretending to read papers that didn't exist. Others lowered their heads. One whispered, "Oh my God," barely audibly. Shame filled the air. She simply held her daughter and sustained the gaze of someone who knows exactly the power she carries and the injustice she faced. The supervisor looked at Maya again, this time unable to hide her astonishment. The air felt dense. She swallowed hard and tried to regain her posture. She apologized on behalf of the agency, justifying the approach as part of safety procedures involving unaccompanied minors. But even her voice trembled with guilt. She knew, everyone knew, that it wasn't the procedure that failed, it was the premature judgment. It was the gaze, trained to doubt first and listen later. And now they stood before a woman who symbolized exactly what the country still needed to learn. That respect shouldn't depend on rank or appearance, and that some lessons, when lived on the skin, hurt more than any words. Maya was escorted back to the boarding area, but now the footsteps echoing on the polished airport floor no longer carried doubt. They carried uncomfortable reverence. Two agents walked ahead of her, opening the way, but avoiding eye contact. One was wiping his glasses, even though they weren't dirty. The other adjusted his badge as if that could hide his shame. Maya said nothing, but her silence said everything. It was the kind of silence that lingers, that teaches, that is never forgotten. When the doors opened and she walked back into the terminal, the atmosphere shifted. It was no longer just an airport. It had become a stage for reckoning. The murmuring from before suddenly stopped. Almost by reflex, time seemed to slow down. People who had whispered now looked away. Others stared in disbelief. And in the middle of the crowd, a black woman stood up. She wasn't young. She had wrinkles near her eyes and a posture that blended fatigue and courage. She walked slowly toward Maya, touched her arm gently, and said, almost in a whisper, "Thank you for not lowering your head. You spoke for all of us." Maya nodded, her eyes glassy, but she didn't cry. Ava looked around, full of energy, more protected than ever. A man farther back spoke out loud, "That was ugly. What a shameful situation." A young Asian woman pulled out her phone and began recording. She felt that this moment had to be captured. The employee who had started it all was still behind the counter, her face red, her eyes glued to a screen that was turned off. But there was nothing left to hide. Because everyone there knew. They knew what they had done. They knew who Maya was, now, and they knew what she had endured to keep standing. At the gate, Maya calmly handed over her boarding pass. The attendant took it with both hands, as if holding something precious. She passed through without saying a word, but she left behind a trail of silence. A silence heavy with shame, but also full of learning. It was as if the air said, "It will never be the same again," and in fact, it wouldn't be. This was only the beginning. The flight to New York was quiet. Maya didn't sleep. While Ava rested peacefully in her arms, she mentally replayed every detail of what had happened just hours earlier. Every veiled question, every sideways glance, every silence loaded with judgment. But now, inside that cabin, only one thing mattered. How to turn that into something greater than pain. Into something useful. Into something alive. The Congress gathered leaders, jurists, activists, and academics from all across the country. Maya had been invited to close the event with a technical keynote on systemic discrimination in access to justice, a subject she knew with authority. And that's exactly what she did. She walked onto the stage with Ava, in her arms, handed her daughter to a fellow jurist in the front row, adjusted the microphone, opened her presentation, and for 40 minutes she backed up, with data, precedents, and analysis, what she had been denouncing for years. But what no one knew, what no one expected, was that the most important part was still to come. She closed her laptop calmly, took a sip of water, breathed deeply, and said, "These past few days I was reminded of a truth that no title protects me from. I am still judged, not by who I am, but by what I look like. 3 days ago, I was detained at an airport with my daughter in my arms, not because of a mistake, not because of a crime, but because of a presumption that my love for her was suspicious, that my motherhood had to be proven." The silence in the audience was so complete, you could hear hearts beating. In that cold room, my documents were correct. My daughter was calm. I was within the law, within reason, within love. But none of that was enough, because what mattered in that moment wasn't the truth. It was the color of my skin, the shade of my daughter's, the idea that I couldn't possibly belong in that embrace. And only when the system found out who I was, on paper, did it begin to see me as a person. She stepped slightly closer to the microphone. I am a federal judge, but in that moment I was just another black woman being pulled from the place she belonged. I was just another mother being pushed away from her own affection. And that's why today, I speak for every mother who will never step onto this stage, for every child who has been pulled from their rightful place, for every body judged before the first word. I didn't come here to turn pain into performance. I came to turn silence into structure. To say clearly, respect is not a reward. It is a foundation. Love has no color, and belonging shouldn't require a badge. Today, I bring my daughter with me on this stage, not for pride, but because I want her to grow up in a country where no one is judged by how they look. When she finished, no one applauded right away. There was a reverent silence, deep, almost sacred, a rare kind of silence that only happens when a very uncomfortable truth has just been exposed, and no one has the courage to look away. And then, slowly, the entire room stood. First, out of respect, then, in applause. In the days that followed, Maya's speech went viral. Excerpts from her talk opened newscasts, were quoted in podcasts, and spread across social media. The judge declined interview requests, but she wrote an article published in the New York Times where she said, "I wasn't the first, and I fear I won't be the last. But now, maybe I can be a bridge. If my name caused discomfort in that room, it's because it carries centuries of voices that were silenced. And this time, the impact didn't stay just in the words." The TSA announced the creation of a new training program for employees at all major airports in the country, focused on fighting structural racism and unconscious bias. For the first time, training sessions stopped being a bureaucratic obligation and started touching real wounds. Cases like Maya's were included in the official training materials. Stories like hers began to be taught, not erased. Maya was invited to join the review team for National Public Service Standards. But she didn't want a position. She wanted to help build something that would truly reach those on the other side of the counter. She requested that the training include testimonies from mothers, fathers, and children who had lived through similar experiences. And she made sure to say, "I don't want punishment. I want this to never happen again." Even so, the employees directly involved in what happened to her were called in for an internal process. All of them underwent a specific in-person training, with Maya in the room. Not to embarrass them, but so they could look into the eyes of the woman they nearly dehumanized, and understand what really needs to change. The airline, for its part, created a direct channel for discrimination complaints and publicly committed to changes in its organizational culture. Schools, universities, and companies began using Maya's speech as a case study in training sessions and discussion circles. Although she never asked for the spotlight, she became a symbol. Not because she shouted, but because she stood firm. Because she didn't lower her head. Because she chose to teach instead of retaliate. And maybe that's why she was so powerful. At the end of the event, Maya returned home just as she had left, with her daughter in her arms, her dignity intact, and a new weight on her shoulders. Only now it was not a weight she carried alone. It was shared by thousands of people who saw themselves in her, who heard themselves in her speech, who, for the first time, saw their own pain being taken seriously. She knew the episode at the airport was not the end of anything, just another beginning. There was still much to change, much to be said, much to confront. But in that moment she was sure of one thing. Being someone important is not enough to be respected. It's necessary that any person, whoever they are, is also respected. Now tell me in the comments, have you ever been through something similar? Or witnessed a situation like this? How many Mayas have passed by you, invisible, silenced, suspect by default? Let's turn this comment section into a place of listening and empathy. After all, how many Black people still need to be disbelieved before we understand that the problem isn't in them, but in the eyes of those who insist on seeing less? This story is not just about racism. It's about humanity. Maybe it's time we all started looking differently, listening better, understanding that respect is not granted, it is practiced. Maybe that's how the world begins to change, because some stories are born from a mistake, but the ones that stay are the ones that bring change. If you know someone who needs to hear this, share it. And if you want to keep hearing real stories that inspire, that hurt, but also awaken, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because as long as silence exists, we will keep speaking.